Isaiah is here. We'll wait about 2 more minutes and we'll get started, guys.
All right.
Still just got the 2 of us. Yep.
I guess so.
Well, let's do it.
All right, we can go ahead. Let me pull out my notes. How you guys been doing?
All right.
That's good.
Doing all right too.
Y'all have a good break.
Yeah, I guess.
Well, we've got just 3 days of notes because, you know, the week before spring break was a short week. We also finished Unit 7 right at the end of break. So I've got 2 days worth of notes at the end of Unit 7, and I've got the first day's worth of notes for Unit 8. Have either of you had a chance to look them over at all?
I went through it yesterday, just only skimmed it a little.
Okay. Malik, what were you going to say?
I just said same as Isaiah's.
Okay. Did anything stand out to you guys or anything you wanted me to go over in particular before I got started?
Not really.
Okay. So I guess I'll go ahead and get started with the notes, and I'll stop in between each day and see if there's anything else you want me to do. So basically, the first day's worth of notes was basically how the war in Vietnam wrapped up. Were either of you guys here last time we met before the break?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so do you guys remember anything about the Tet Offensive at all?
I don't think so. It sounds familiar though.
Most people who study Vietnam consider the Tet Offensive the most important part of the war. Most people see it as the turning point. Before Tet, most Americans thought we were going to be able to beat the communists in Vietnam. But Tet was a sneak attack, kind of. You know, the communists attacked the U.S. and the South Vietnamese all throughout the country, all at the same time. It took us a couple of months to beat that back. So, you know, we were able to stop the communists in that battle, but it made Americans at home question, well, how are we going to win the war when they just keep coming back every time we hit them? And so from Tet onward, there's no real discussion about winning Vietnam. The discussion is how do we get out of Vietnam? And that cost LBJ his presidency. Nobody liked LBJ at that point. And so LBJ decided not to run for president. He was the last president who could have run for another term but chose not to. So you had this big political battle over who was going to take over. And Nixon was the guy who did that. Nixon, of course, ran against Kennedy in 1960 and lost. He was Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years. So Nixon comes in 69 saying that he's got a plan to end the war in Vietnam. And his plan was this thing known as Vietnamization. And I'm going to try to show you that real quick. I think this one will work. Yeah, that works. All right. And present. You guys see the graph?
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So what is this graph showing us?
Troops in Vietnam.
Yes. And you see the highest number? Can somebody tell me about how many was in Vietnam at its highest point?
Like around
Probably
500 something.
300,000.
Yeah, about 530,000, somewhere in there. You know, that's a whole lot of troops, right? Like in Iraq, the most troops we ever had in Iraq, when you guys were about being born, really, was about 150,000. And you can see just a huge amount of troops in Vietnam compared to Iraq. And part of the reason that was so big is you don't have the technology like you do today. You don't have the drone strikes. You don't have the precision air attacks like you do nowadays. So you need a lot more boots on the ground to get stuff done. And you see it start to spike in 65. Do you guys see that?
Yeah.
That's after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which we went over, and then it goes up each year. That's under LBJ. That's the escalation idea. And then in 68, you have Tet, and then the next year, 69, what starts to happen?
It's starting to go down.
Correct. And that's Nixon. Nixon is 69 all the way down to the end. And it doesn't drop to zero instantly, but you have a steady drop just like you had a steady increase. It almost mirrors the other side of the graph. And that is Vietnamization. The idea is that you slowly take Americans out of Vietnam, and while they're leaving, you're basically putting pressure on South Vietnam to say, hey, this is your country, Vietnam. You need to stand up and do the fighting yourself. And so That's kind of the plan with Vietnamization. That's why it's given the name Vietnamization. You're asking the Vietnamese to do more of the fighting itself. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Of course, you're going to keep bombing North Vietnam. Basically, the idea is South Vietnam doesn't have the air power to bomb the North and the communists. So you keep that up from the American perspective, but more and more of the ground fighting is going to be done by the South Vietnamese. While this is going on, America is divided about all these things for a few reasons. One, you have a incident in Vietnam known as the My Lai massacre, which is where you had about, I forget how, trying to think. Isaiah, you're in ROTC, right?
Yes.
Do they go over like the size of like platoons and squads and things like that in ROTC, like how big they are?
Yeah, they do.
How big is a platoon? Do you know?
It's like 2 or 3 squads, and then
But like how many
Well,
people are in a platoon?
like probably like 10 or more, or like 10 or 15 around there.
That's what I thought. I wasn't sure. Yeah, so you had a platoon of American soldiers who were looking for the Viet Cong. Do you guys remember who the Viet Cong are?
I
No.
think so.
Malik, you said you do or don't think so.
I said I think so.
Take a guess. Give it a shot.
It's like the troops fighting for North Vietnam, or am I thinking of something else?
They're supporting North Vietnam, but they're communists who live in South Vietnam. So
Oh,
so they're communists who are fighting for the North, but they live in the South. Those are the Viet Cong. And it really sucks for us in the South Vietnamese military because they blend in. You can't tell who's with the Viet Cong and who's not with the Viet Cong. And you know they'll mix in with the population, kind of like how in the Middle East, you know, when we were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, you know, a lot of the terrorists you can't tell them apart from ordinary people. So you have a lot of similarities there. You had a platoon of American soldiers go into this Vietnamese village known as My Lai looking for Viet Cong, and they, you know, couldn't find them, whatever. And these soldiers had gotten frustrated because they had been attacked by the Viet Cong recently, and they started killing people, innocent people. There's a movie called Platoon that has a scene in it that's similar to the My Lai incident, where they start rounding up civilians and start killing them out of frustration. And the only reason anybody found out about it was there was an American attack helicopter flying patrol in the area, and the pilot saw this from above and said, "Man, this is crazy. They can't be doing stuff like this." And the helicopter pilot landed the helicopter there on the ground and told his machine gunner, he said, "If these guys won't listen to my orders," because he was a superior officer, "then you are going to shoot the American soldiers because we're not having this." Because they were killing old men, women, children. They were just cold blood killing them. And so when this came out, this was like the big stain on the American military. This is why a lot of hippies in the U.S. called Vietnam veterans who were coming back from the war. You know, they were throwing stuff at them, you know, spitting on them, calling them baby killers. I mean, it was really bad. You know, because everybody got painted with that broad brush. Nixon said he's going to end the war, but while this is all going on, he starts bombing Laos and Cambodia. And just a reminder, real quick, I'm going to project this for you. Laos and Cambodia were some of the main supply routes into Vietnam. Can you guys see the map that I put up here?
Yeah.
Okay. So you see the black arrows are coming through Laos and coming through Cambodia somewhat, and they're getting their supplies into South Vietnam that way. And LBJ had already bombed Laos and Cambodia. The thing is this all came out under Nixon, because Nixon stepped up the bombing of Laos and Cambodia, and that made the hippies and the doves and the people who were against the war in Vietnam get even more upset. They're like, hey man, you said you were going to end the war in Vietnam, but you're making it bigger, man. And so that was a big deal. And then in the middle of all these protests, you have college students get shot and killed on 2 different American universities, which I'm going to try to find the color pic. Yeah, there we go. So this is a shooting. The National Guard in Ohio had been attacked by the hippies right before this protest. And so the Ohio National Guard was, doing riot control because they thought this was going to get out of hand. And the National Guard shot and killed, I think, 3 students at Kent State. And you see one of them lying there on the sidewalk. There was also another shooting at Jackson State, which is in Mississippi, that doesn't get a lot of attention paid to, probably because Kent State was, I don't know if Kent State's a private school or not, but these are like wealthy white kids, and Jackson State is an HBCU, which had mostly African American students, not well off. But you had 2 big shootings like that really shook people up, and a lot of people were divided over that. Another thing that came out was you had somebody, I think it was somebody who worked in the Pentagon. He got a hold of a bunch of classified documents about the war, going all the way back to the beginning when LBJ sent in combat troops. And it showed how LBJ had lied about the way he was conducting the war. And this guy who was working in the military sent all this to the New York Times, and the New York Times published the whole set of papers, and it made it look like the government couldn't be trusted. The government lies all the time. And so, it just shows how bitter people had gotten over the war. But you guys remember the graph, how it's getting lower and lower, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So they came up with a peace deal to end the war in Vietnam, known as the Paris Peace Accords. And the Paris Peace Accords looked like it was going to give Nixon what he wanted, this whole peace with honor thing. But, because what comes out of it is that the North Vietnamese promised to leave the South alone. The Viet Cong promised to stop having attacks around the country of South Vietnam. South Vietnam says, hey, we're going to have elections someday to figure out how we're going to hash this all out, so we'll resolve it all peacefully. And since there's no more war anymore, because the agreement said everybody's going to stop fighting, everybody's going to send their prisoners back to where they originally came from, and now the U.S. doesn't have to be there, and so all the soldiers get to come back to the United States. So for Nixon, it looks like a big win for him. The guy he had actually negotiating this on the ground was a guy by the name of Henry Kissinger, who, believe it or not, is still alive and still, speaks out about issues from time to time. He gets the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating all this. But once the soldiers leave, guess what North Vietnam is going to do?
They're gonna get aggressive again.
They are. They're going to get aggressive, and they're actually going to invade South Vietnam 2 years later in 75. And the president at the time, because Nixon, we're going to find out in tomorrow's notes, had to resign. He had to quit. So the new president, President Ford, you know, he's no one's going to listen to him about going back to Vietnam because this war was so long, was so bloody, was so divisive, and so expensive. Congress has stepped in and said, you can't go back to Vietnam. They're on their own. And that was because right around the time this was all happening, Congress passed a new law called the War Powers Act that says anytime the president uses combat troops, in a mission, they have to get permission from Congress to stay there beyond 60 days. So, like, if the president wants to send special forces in somewhere, do like a quick operation and come out, the president can do that. But if they're going to stay there longer than 60 days, they have to get permission from Congress. And Congress, no way, was going to give President Ford any permission to go back to Vietnam. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So now there is no North Vietnam or South Vietnam. It's just all one Vietnam. The communists took that over once we left. Any questions on the notes so far?
Is Vietnam still communist till like today?
It is. They kind of did like China did, which we'll get into in Unit 8, where China still has a communist government and they have a communist police system to keep people from protesting, but they have a capitalist type economy, so their country makes enough money so the people kind of accept the government that they have more readily. Anything else?
No.
All right, we'll move on to the next set of notes. Most of it deals with feminism. I put it in with Unit 7 because, feminism is a form of civil rights. You have women who feel like they do not have equal rights and treatments in this country, just like African Americans we had at the start of Unit 7. So feminism, the most basic definition of it, is that women should have the same opportunities as men have. In the year 1960, there were not a lot of people who believed in it or listened to it, but in 61, it's a little more. In 62, it's a little more. It just builds up more and more year by year. So by the time you get to the end of the 60s, you have a lot of feminists with women and young people, especially. And the woman who started it all was a woman by the name of Betty Friedan. She wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. And she said that women were suffering after World War II. Remember, World War II, America told women, you can do it. Rosie the Riveter flexing. When women were working in the factories, they were joining the military. They were helping us win World War II. And then after the war was over, what did American society tell these women?
I'm gonna take a guess.
Go for it.
To like have them have equal rights, so they won't have probably, I guess.
Well, that's what women wanted, but remember, society at this time was not controlled by women. A lot of people would argue it's still not controlled by women. And so after World War II, women were told, hey, thanks for helping us out with the war, but the war is over. We don't need you in these factories anymore. All your husbands, fiancés, and boyfriends, they're coming back. They want their jobs back. And you ladies need to get married and help make families with them. And so women were told one thing, and then they were told something completely different right after that. And they were told in all these I mean, like, if you look up, like, if you're bored today, go to YouTube and like type in 1950s commercials, and you'll see all these commercials of, like, women, buying, vacuum cleaners and laundry soap, and they should be so happy doing all these homemaking type stuff. And so women are like bombarded with this message in the 50s, be a happy housewife, have kids, that's what's going to make you happy. And a lot of women weren't happy. In fact, a lot of women were, undergoing psychiatric treatment and were dealing with, real bad depression and anxiety and panic attacks. And nobody really understood why, because most of your psychologists and psychiatrists at this time were men, and the men didn't get it. And Betty Friedan's like, I get it. The women were told you're powerful and important, and then the next second they're not. And it's like their brain's fighting with itself. They don't know what to do. So, I mean, you can go to a grocery store, you can go to Walmart when things get back to normal and see this. You go to a store, just hang out by the checkout lines, like sit on one of the benches and see like some kid grab a candy bar, and the mom says, no, you can't get it. And the kid starts bawling his eyes out because, at home they probably get whatever they want, and now they can't get what they want, and it doesn't make sense. The women, this doesn't make sense. They're being told one thing, and then the next they're being told something else. They don't know what to do, and they're flipping out. And Betty Friedan says, you don't want them to flip out. Treat them the way you're supposed to treat them. Women have the right to vote. Excuse me. They want to be able to work wherever they want to work. They want to be able to decide whether or not to get married, whether or not to have children. They should have a say in those things. Remember, at this time, it was practiced that if a woman had a job, she only had a job until she was married, and once she was married, she was expected to quit the job. And a lot of bosses would fire women once they got married if they didn't quit the job. And so Betty Friedan is like, this is bullcrap. And so they start a new civil rights organization just for women called NOW. And NOW still exists. NOW stands for the National Organization for Women. And they still fight a lot of these battles for women's rights, equal pay and things like that. Gloria Steinem kind of steps this up a notch in the early 1970s. And Congress passes an Equal Rights Amendment, which I think, that was the last warm-up assignment before the break, which I can't remember which of y'all have done. I'm pretty sure Virginia's done it. But and they're making a movie about this woman in that video clip. People are buzzing about it. This woman called Phyllis Schlafly. And Phyllis Schlafly, a lot of people think, killed the Equal Rights Amendment. And all the Equal Rights Amendment was going to be this one sentence added to the Constitution that said it is illegal to deny somebody their rights based on sex, whether they're a man or a woman. That's all it was going to say. And Phyllis Schlafly said, if you add that to the Constitution, you're going to have to start drafting women. And this is right after Vietnam. And so they're like, oh, crap, drafting women. That means my daughter is going to be sent to fight in the next war. My daughter is going to come home in a body bag. And I don't want that to happen. And so you had a lot of states get pressure put on them not to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And most people think it was because of her way to put that out effectively, that message kept the Equal Rights Amendment from passing. And so it was never added to the Constitution. Now, some people are upset. They're like, oh, man, that means that, women's rights aren't protected. They are protected. They're protected under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that helped African Americans have their rights protected, but it's just not written into the Constitution like the feminists had wanted. You also have Title IX added to the civil rights laws in the 70s that said that women's education had to be funded to the same levels of male education. This is why, for example, you don't have, a lot of all girls schools or all boys schools, especially in public education. But sports is part of that. Like if you have a club, like if you have a males only club, then you got to have, like a First Ladies of Lexington club to equal that out. This is why, like, all the boys sports money, Coach Beverly has to spend the same amount of money on boys sports as on girls sports. This is why you start to get a lot more girls sports. Before Title IX, you didn't really have a lot of girls basketball teams, girl volleyball teams, girl track teams, girl soccer teams. Those are all going to take off because of Title IX. And then the one last thing that deals with feminism, you have this really big Supreme Court decision in the early 1970s called Roe versus Wade, which is going to legalize a woman's right to have an abortion. And the Supreme Court ruled on this based on a woman's right to privacy, which is not written in the Constitution. There is no part that says you have the right to privacy, but the Supreme Court said that it is an implied right under the Ninth Amendment, which says that there are certain rights that exist, but we can't think of them all. They're not all going to be written down, but you still have them. Like you have the right to decide where you're going to live in the United States. You have the right to decide, if you want to keep going to school when you graduate this year or whether or not you want to get a job. You have the right to decide who you want to marry in this country. None of these are written down, but they're all implied as part of the Ninth Amendment. So the Supreme Court said the right for a woman to have an abortion, especially early in her pregnancy, is considered a right that's going to be protected. And that's going to be greatly expanded upon in the next 10 years. So by the time you get into the early to mid 1980s, it's going to become easier and easier for women to get abortions in all kinds of situations. And that's going to become more divisive as time goes on. And it's still considered a very divisive issue up through today. You also have Hispanic and Latinos fighting for rights, and the most well-known person, I'm going to project him up here. He is an American who lived, I should say, he died in the 90s, who lived in California. Oh yeah, I'm going to use this picture. That's even better. So let me project him real quick. There we go. You guys see the picture?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This guy is Cesar Chavez. Not Cesar Chavez, he's Cesar Chavez. And he was a farm worker in California, and he picked grapes for a living. And he became famous in the 70s because he started a union for the farm workers. The farm workers in California were treated very badly. They were put in these little shacks, were paid hardly anything at all. And since most of them weren't American citizens, they were afraid to speak out because they were afraid they would get sent back down across the border. But Cesar Chavez is like, you can't shut me up because I'm an American citizen and I'm going to fight for the rights of these people. And the way he got people to pay attention to it was you see who's in the background, who's behind Cesar Chavez?
Kennedy and Gandhi.
Yes, this is Robert Kennedy, the guy who got shot in '68 while he was running for president. Robert Kennedy and Chavez formed a partnership where Kennedy was going to speak out and try to help the farm workers get more attention paid to him. And he's got Gandhi behind him because Gandhi got India free from the British through nonviolence, just like Martin Luther King. And so Chavez, Gandhi, and King all used nonviolent protests to get what they wanted. And as more people paid attention, he said, you guys need to boycott any fruits or vegetables grown in California because this is how they treat us in California. and it worked. People stopped buying stuff from California. The farmers started losing money, and they agreed to negotiate with him as the leader of the farm workers. And so you had this new union created called the UFW, the United Farm Workers. It's going to be pretty effective. So questions about Cesar Chavez, feminism, any of this stuff before we wrap up today?
I don't have any questions.
Okay. So we got one more set of notes and we'll be all set. We got Nixon becoming president. We talked about what Nixon did in Vietnam. We'll talk about some other stuff he did today, and we'll be all set. So Nixon said basically the reason he's going to win is because the news people pay a lot of attention to the hippies. The hippies are loud. The hippies are out there. Every time you go around, you see them protesting. But Nixon says they don't make up a majority of Americans. In fact, the majority of Americans are working. They're not paying attention to this political stuff. And those are the people, Nixon says, who supports him. So he calls this the silent majority. All right. And he also notices that the Democrats aren't getting support in the South because of civil rights anymore. And so Nixon takes advantage of that to pick up a lot of support in the South. And this is when the South starts supporting the Republican Party. And still to this day, the South supports the Republicans a lot more than they support the Democrats. This is called the Southern strategy. And since the South doesn't really like the federal government much anyway, and that's still true to this day, the Nixon says, well, let's start a new form of federalism where we're going to give more power back to the states and kind of back off the power of the federal government. I've talked about Kissinger a little bit, so I'll put him up here just so you know what he's like. Kissinger is probably the single most important person working for Nixon. And I pull up an image shot and there's like a gazillion different pictures of him. So I'm just going to put the whole montage up here and let you look at him. So give me a minute. Remember I told you he's still alive, right?
Yeah.
All right. If I get rid of these little things here. If you look on the very bottom right, you see that Chinese guy there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is the leader of China today. That is Xi Jinping meeting with Kissinger. And so, like I said, he's still active in international affairs. That's like his specialty, is dealing with other countries. Kissinger was not born in the United States. Kissinger was actually born as a German Jewish person who escaped Germany when Hitler took over and lived the rest of his life here in the United States. Let's see, I'll go ahead and put the thing. This picture here, and then the one down from it, that is Kissinger when he was working for Nixon. And so that's kind of what he looked like while he was working out the deal with Vietnam. But Kissinger also came up with this idea that instead of fighting all of the communists all of the time, a smarter way would be to make friends, is to try to be friends with one of the communist countries. And that would make the other communist countries jealous and nervous. And then the communist countries, instead of focusing all their energy on the United States, you would have them kind of fight off against each other. And that policy of his was known as Realpolitik. That's a German word where you say, hey, you don't do things because they're the right thing to do. You do things because they work. And so they come up with this other policy called détente, where you calm things down with the communist world. And so Kissinger convinces Nixon to reach out to China, because China back then was like North Korea today. Like no country in the world wanted to deal with China. Everybody in the world hated China. And Kissinger's like, well, Mr. President, you'll see China, it's pretty big, and you see if you make friends with the Chinas, they can make us some money. We can sell things to the Chinese. So Nixon visits China, builds a relationship with China. Have any of you all ever watched the Forrest Gump movie?
Not yet.
I don't think
That's a
so.
good. Well, we're out of school until May 15th. Try to get a bootleg copy, or go to YouTube and look up type of Forrest Gump in China. Okay, because like a lot of the Forrest Gump stuff, it's like a ripoff of current events back in the day that he was going through it. So it kind of like pokes fun at it a little bit, but you learn about it too. And so when we start getting friends with China, that makes the Russians nervous, because the Russians saw themselves as the leaders of communism, and they're like, what is going on? They cannot make friends with America. We are the real communists. We started all of this. Just because China has more people does not mean they're better than us. And so the Soviets start knocking on the door and say, hey, America, why are you friends with China? Why don't you be friends with us? The Russians, we are not bad people. And so now you get the Russians and the Chinese start sniping at each other, going at each other. And so Kissinger's laughing all the way, because he's like, Mr. President, I told you this would work. Now, instead of them fighting us, they are tearing each other apart, and we are getting stronger and stronger. And so Kissinger, I mean, he's a real smart guy. And in the middle of all this, he got a deal with the Russians called the SALT Treaty, which was your warm-up assignment for today. I saw Virginia had already knocked it out, where we're going to make a deal with the Russians that says, hey, the whole thing of the Cold War is, you got more nukes than us, I'm going to get more than you, and you see this hand, so we're going to go up and up and up, this whole escalation of nuclear weapons. And Nixon and the Soviet leader, a guy named Brezhnev, said, we already got enough. We have enough weapons on our side to kill every living thing on Earth. And you have enough nuclear weapons to kill every living thing on Earth. We don't need to build more nuclear weapons. Let's just stop it where it is. And so that was the first nuclear deal between us and the Russians. And it made a lot of people hopeful that we could start coming up with peaceful ways to end the Cold War, that you wouldn't have to have World War III to solve the Cold War. It's not over, but it kind of gives us some hope that the Cold War might end someday in a peaceful way. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's all I got today. I saw Virginia bounced, and she hasn't come back in yet, so I don't know if she's coming back or not. Do any of y'all have questions about anything we went over today?
Nope.
No.
All right. Just a reminder, if either of you have any individualized questions you have about anything, I'll have video office hours at 3 today and 3 on Thursday. We'll meet back up again as a class next Tuesday at 9 and 1. We're, like I said, we started on Unit 8 notes. I think I've emailed those to you guys. Just make sure you kind of keep up with them, the assignments, that kind of thing. And that's pretty much all I've got. Do any of y'all have questions about grades or anything else whatsoever?
For the warm-up, they still count as grade, right?
Yeah, I'm putting them in as grades. What they're doing is they're gonna make a pass-fail for quarter 4, and I'm basing the pass-fail based on how much work you guys do from home.
Okay.
You can still look them up on Power School and knock them out, though. And I've given you guys, because you guys, and Virginia has too, have done quite a bit of work from home. I know, Isaiah, you've done more of the packets, which is good. but since you guys have been doing work from home and Virginia's been doing work from home, I've given you guys. I made up an assignment called I forget what I call it. It's like it was like an award test or something, and I gave both of you guys 100 for that. And so I'm just trying to get people who are sitting at home and not doing a lot to kind of buy into it. Because I mean, I know you guys probably got other stuff going on, but I appreciate the fact that you guys are working, that you guys are coming to class and getting stuff done. So I want to thank you all for that.
You're welcome.
Oh yeah,
All right.
but how do like late grades work?
I'm not assigning late credit to the warm ups that you guys do because, like I said, I know you guys have other things that might be pulling your attention at home. So anything that's in there that says it's a 0, I'm going to change them to 100 or whatever correct grade once you submit those assignments.
I was wondering that because I kind of fell behind on my warm ups and stuff.
Yeah, just like when you make those up, I'll give you full credit. Unless, of course, you leave out questions. Like, I had somebody today who left out one of the questions. It was a 7-question assignment from first block. He did 6 out of 7 questions, so I gave him an 86. But that's how I'm going to grade it. I'm going to grade it like you turned them in the day they were supposed to be due. The only thing I'm taking off for are merit points for homework if they're late. But that doesn't affect your grade at all. All it affects are the merit points.
All right.
All right.
All right, sound good?
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, I will see you guys next week or during office hours.
Okay.
All right, y'all take care.
You too.
All right, bye-bye.
Yeah.
Yep.